On a cold Christmas Eve, a small town's priest, Father Gabriel, welcomes a mysterious homeless man, Thomas, into St. Anne's Chapel. What follows is a night of extraordinary miracles that tests the community's faith, uncovers hidden truths, and offers redemption where it was least expected. As Thomas's past as a once great doctor who vanished years ago is revealed, the townspeople face the challenge of reconciling judgment with compassion. Can an act of courage and forgiveness heal old wounds? And when redemption comes knocking, will the town be ready to accept it? The snow fell in hushed waves over the cobbled streets of Milltown, weaving a silent blanket over the worn buildings and casting everything in an ethereal glow. St. Anne's Chapel stood at the town's heart, its steeple a dark silhouette against the navy sky, a solitary star peeking out just above its peak. Inside, the chapel was warmed by the flicker of candlelight, their flames dancing in a whispered chorus. Father Gabriel, with shoulders hunched from the cold and worry carved into his brow, placed the last taper in its holder on the altar. He sighed, the sound barely audible over the crackling hearth. His heart was a storm of doubt. Weeks had passed since he had seen the pews filled with hopeful faces. Christmas Eve was supposed to be a night of renewal, yet he felt emptier than ever. His faith, once as unyielding as the stone walls around him, now felt as thin and fragile as the frost on the window pane. A sudden knock rattled the door, startling Gabriel from his reverie. The sound echoed through the chapel, breaking the silence like a prayer answered. Gabriel's footsteps were hesitant as he moved to the entrance, the cold seeping through the old wooden floorboards beneath his feet. When he opened the door, a sharp gust swept inside, bringing with it a figure hunched and trembling. A man in layers of ragged clothing, his skin weathered and dark, stood with eyes wide and desperate. He was old, perhaps 70, with a face marked by deep lines that spoke of years of hardship and stories untold. "Please, Father," the man croaked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Just for a moment to warm myself. I won't stay long." Gabriel's throat tightened. There was an unspoken rule of the town: to close one's doors and harden one's heart when the cold settled in, lest you find yourself with more mouths to feed and less hope to offer. But Gabriel knew that to turn away a soul on this night, of all nights, would seal the cracks in his faith permanently. "Come in," Gabriel said, stepping aside. The man stumbled in, eyes darting to the modest room, the simple altar, the small tree bedecked with a few handmade ornaments. The warmth of the hearth brought a shiver through him, a sign that his body was beginning to thaw from the chill outside. "What's your name?" Gabriel asked as he draped a rough woolen blanket over the man's shoulder. "Thomas," the man said, meeting Gabriel's eyes with a look that carried both gratitude and a guarded edge. Gabriel noted the way Thomas's hands trembled, not just from the cold, but with the unmistakable shudder of someone who had fought too many battles against the unforgiving world. "Thomas," Gabriel echoed, the name lingering in the air like an old hymn. He led the man to a wooden bench near the fire and ladled a bowl of thin soup from the pot simmering over the flames. Thomas accepted it with a nod, the lines of his face softening as he sipped. "I haven't seen you around town," Gabriel said, more a statement than a question. Thomas looked into the fire, the light reflecting off his eyes, making them shine like wet stones. "I was once a teacher," he said, his voice a raspy murmur. "Before life turned and took more than it ever gave." Gabriel nodded, understanding the language of loss even without further details. Silence settled between them, but it was not uncomfortable. It was a silence that spoke of shared pain and the simple relief of not facing it alone. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the chapel, there was a warmth that started to bloom, not just from the fire, but from something more. Gabriel felt it stir within him, a spark that had been buried deep under layers of doubt and fatigue. As Thomas's breathing slowed, the chapel's bell tolled, a deep, resonant sound that marked the hour. Midnight Mass was to begin, and the faint sound of footsteps crunching through snow reached their ears. The townspeople were coming, drawn by tradition, by a need for hope, or perhaps by something they could not name. Gabriel glanced at Thomas, who clutched the bowl as though it were a lifeline. "You're welcome to stay for the service," he said, his voice soft, inviting. Thomas looked up, surprise flickering across his tired features before he nodded, a shadow of a smile touching his lips. The first parishioners began to trickle in, eyes darting to the unfamiliar figure at the front of the room. Whispers followed, but Gabriel raised a hand, and the murmurs ceased. Tonight, St. Anne's would hold more than just the echo of hymns. It would cradle the fragile hope of two men searching for warmth against the cold of a harsh world, and neither knew that this night, marked by snow and uncertainty, would gift them a miracle unlike any other. The chapel slowly filled with the faithful, bundled in layers of wool and flannel, their breath creating puffs of mist in the cold air. Children with wide eyes clutched their parents' hands, while elderly couples shuffled in with measured steps, their faces lit by the warm glow of the candles. As they settled into the pews, a murmur of curiosity rippled through the congregation. All eyes eventually drifted toward Thomas, who sat near the front, clutching the bowl in his gnarled hands. Gabriel watched the subtle shifting of gazes and caught a few raised eyebrows. He met each glance with an unflinching look, daring anyone to voice their skepticism. He could feel the unspoken question in the room. Who was this man? Why was he here on this sacred night? With a deep breath, Gabriel walked to the lectern. His robe billowed slightly as he turned, and the room fell into an expectant silence, the only sound the faint crackle of the fire. He spoke with a calm that belied the storm inside him. "Tonight, we gather as we always do, to remember the birth of hope in the darkest hour. And as we sit here, let us open our hearts not only to those we know, but also to those we do not. Let this night be a reminder that compassion has no boundaries." His eyes swept the room, landing on Thomas, "and that a stranger could be the messenger we never expected." A few of the older parishioners nodded, their skepticism softened by Gabriel's words, but others shifted uneasily, eyes darting away from Thomas as though ignoring him might make him disappear. The first hymn began, a song older than most of the voices that sang it. Gabriel's baritone led the congregation, filling the space with deep, resonant notes that seemed to cling to the wall. As the second verse began, a soft, broken voice joined from the front pew. Thomas, eyes closed and lips trembling, sang the words that came as if pulled from the deepest part of his memory. The voices around him faltered, a few stopping altogether as the parishioners watched Thomas. His singing was cracked and uneven, a man trying to remember a melody that once lit his soul. Yet it was hauntingly beautiful, and slowly others joined in, their voices carrying Thomas's like a wave. Gabriel's heart clenched as he saw Thomas's eyes open, misted and glistening in the candlelight. Suddenly, the doors at the back of the chapel burst open, swept wide by a fierce gust of wind. The flames of the candles wavered wildly, casting chaotic shadows across the walls. A few children gasped, clutching their parents as the cold swirled into the warmth of the chapel, mingling with the scent of pine and melting wax. The song stuttered to a halt as Gabriel raised a hand to steady the congregation. In the open doorway stood a young boy, no more than 7, his dark skin flushed from the cold. He wore a coat that was 2 sizes too big and clutched a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. He scanned the crowd, his eyes wide with both determination and hesitation. "Father Gabriel!" the boy called, his voice sharp and clear. He ran forward, the crowd parting as whispers erupted like the rustle of dry leaves. "It's my grandpa. He's not waking up. Please, I need help." Gabriel's heart raced as he took in the boy's flushed cheeks and the tremor in his small hands. He stepped away from the lectern, already moving toward the boy, but stopped when Thomas, with a speed that belied his frail frame, stood and walked up to them. "I know how to help," Thomas said, a resolute note in his voice that hadn't been there before. Gabriel blinked, startled by the change in him. "You know what to do?" Gabriel asked, the weight of the moment pressing on him. "Yes," Thomas nodded, "but we need to hurry." Without hesitation, the 3 of them, Gabriel, the boy, and Thomas, pushed through the crowd and out into the cold night. The wind bit at their faces, and snow swirled around their feet as they raced down the narrow streets. The boy led them to a small house with a roof that sagged under the weight of years and neglect. Inside, an old man lay motionless on a cot, his chest barely moving. The room was stark, the air heavy with worry and the faint, sharp scent of herbs. Thomas knelt beside him, his hands moving with practiced precision. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small vial of dark liquid. "From my teaching days," Thomas whispered, more to himself than anyone else. He tipped the liquid into the old man's mouth and placed a hand over his heart, closing his eyes. A hush fell over the room, broken only by the boy's quiet sobs and Gabriel's whispered prayers. Moments passed that felt like hours. Then, with a shudder and a ragged gasp, the old man's chest rose sharply. His eyes fluttered open, cloudy but aware, and the room seemed to exhale with relief. The boy let out a soft cry, throwing his arms around his grandfather's neck. Gabriel met Thomas's eyes, and for the first time, he saw not a homeless man, but a healer, a savior in disguise. Thomas's own eyes were filled with an emotion Gabriel hadn't seen before: redemption, or perhaps something more profound, a chance to be seen for who he truly was. The wind outside seemed to calm, the snow falling softer now, as if the night itself had borne witness to a miracle. The room remained still, the moment suspended like the last snowflake before it meets the ground. The old man's shallow breaths grew deeper, each one pulling color back into his cheeks. The boy, eyes wide with wonder and relief, held his grandfather's hand as though it were a fragile treasure. Gabriel knelt beside Thomas, the realization of what had just happened pressing on him like the warmth of the hearth on a winter's night. "You saved him," he whispered, the words reverberating with awe. Thomas nodded, but there was no pride in his expression, only the quiet acceptance of someone who had once walked a different path. "A long time ago, I was someone who healed, not someone who begged," he said, his voice low and steady. His eyes were fixed on the old man, who blinked up at the ceiling, tears gathering at the corners of his eye. The small room, filled with the scent of herbs and cold, now seemed luminous with something indefinable. The boy, whose name Gabriel learned was Elias, turned to Thomas and threw his arms around him, the small gesture taking the older man by surprise. Thomas's body stiffened for a moment, then softened as he returned the embrace, eyes closing as if the weight of years lifted from his shoulders. "Thank you," Elias whispered, the word breaking like dawn into the silence. Gabriel felt a prickle at the back of his neck, an unnameable emotion tightening his chest. He looked at Thomas, now bathed in the soft light of gratitude and forgiveness, and realized how wrong the town had been to dismiss this man, how wrong he had been. The sound of footsteps outside signaled the approach of others. A few of the parishioners, who had followed them through the snow, stood in the doorway. Their eyes darted from Gabriel to the old man now stirring, to Thomas, who sat on the floor, exhaustion beginning to show in the lines of his face. There was a murmur of disbelief, curiosity threaded with respect. One woman stepped forward, Mrs. Ingram, whose voice usually rang sharp with gossip, but now trembled with something softer. "Father Gabriel, what happened here? Is that old Mr. Rivera?" she asked, looking at the old man with wide eyes. Gabriel stood, brushing the dust from his robe. "Yes, it is, and it's Thomas who saved him," he said, the declaration clear and without hesitation. He glanced at Thomas, who looked away, a faint blush darkening his weathered cheeks. Mrs. Ingram's eyes softened as they moved to Thomas, taking in the man she had ignored countless times on her way to market, her expression shifting from recognition to regret. The murmuring crowd stilled, waiting for what would come next. One by one, more townspeople entered, their curiosity drawing them in like moths to flame. The chapel's midnight mass was forgotten for the moment, replaced by this impromptu gathering in the smallest house on the street. Gabriel knew that this moment, this extraordinary, unexpected miracle, was reshaping the threads of the community in a way that sermons could not. Thomas shifted on the floor, his body sagging with the weight of fatigue. Gabriel reached out a hand, helping him to his feet. "Come back to the chapel," Gabriel said, the request not just an invitation, but an unspoken apology for every time he too had looked past this man. Thomas's eyes met Gabriel's, and for the first time they were not guarded. He nodded slowly, his lips lifting into a smile that revealed both gratitude and hesitation. The crowd parted as they walked out, Gabriel's arms steadying Thomas as they made their way through the snow. The path back to the chapel, which had seemed long and lonely before, now felt like a bridge to something new. As they entered, the warmth of the fire embraced them, and the murmurs of the crowd followed. Gabriel returned to the altar, the candles now burning steadily, their light brighter somehow. He turned to face the congregation, Thomas by his side. Tonight we witnessed something profound, a reminder that grace is often found in the most unexpected places. Thomas, Gabriel gestured, has shown us that every soul, no matter how forgotten or dismissed, holds a light that can warm even the coldest night. The parishioners listened, their faces a canvas of emotions, some with shame, others with awe, but all with a renewed understanding. A child, clutching her mother's hand, tugged at her sleeve and pointed to Thomas, eyes wide with curiosity. The mother knelt, her expression tender, as she whispered something the child nodded at. Gabriel reached for a hymnal, opening it to a page whose corners were worn and familiar. "Let us sing once more," he said, his voice steady. "Let us sing not just for the hope that was born on this night so long ago, but for the hope we find right here, among us." The first notes of the hymn rose, and Thomas joined in, his voice tentative at first, but growing stronger. The chapel filled with the sound, a harmony that resonated deeper than before. It was no longer just a song, it was a testament, an unspoken vow that no one in this town would be forgotten again. Gabriel watched as Thomas closed his eyes, his features softened in peace. The glow of the candles reflected in the tears that slipped down his cheeks, unbidden but welcome. Gabriel felt his own eyes grow wet, and he did not blink them away. Tonight was for miracles, and they were here, in the singing voices and the shared warmth, more real than any sermon or scripture. Outside, the snow fell gently now, not in a blizzard of cold, but as a blanket that promised a new morning, one where redemption wasn't just a word whispered in prayer, but a truth lived and witnessed. The hymn ended, leaving a resonant silence in the chapel. The quiet was not an absence, but a fullness, the kind that comes when words have done all they can, and only feeling remain. Gabriel glanced at the faces before him. Mrs. Ingram wiping a tear from her cheek. Elias sitting close to his grandfather with a grip so firm it spoke of newfound security. The room was lit not just by candles, but by the softened glow of understanding and hope. Thomas shifted at the front, his weariness evident as he sat on the edge of a pew. Gabriel approached, his robe whispering against the stone floor. He placed a gentle hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Rest now," he said softly. "You've given more than anyone could have asked tonight." Thomas's eyes met Gabriel's, a flicker of emotion crossing them. "I didn't know if I still had it in me," he admitted, voice rough like an old violin string, strained but true. "For years I tried to forget, to stop caring. It was easier that way." Gabriel nodded, understanding more than Thomas knew. The moments he himself had questioned his purpose, doubted the meaning behind the rituals and the words repeated like incantations. Tonight proves that what we carry within us can find its way out, even when we've locked it away. Before Thomas could respond, there was a commotion at the back of the chapel. A group of young men, clad in patched coats and scarves pulled high around their necks, pushed through the door, their faces flushed from the cold and something more, urgency. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped forward, his eyes darting nervously from Thomas to Gabriel. "Father," he said, his voice loud in the hallowed silence, "there's been an accident near the old mill. A horse slipped on the ice and its rider is trapped. We need help." The crowd tensed, the news settling over them like a heavy shroud. Gabriel's heart clenched. The mill was a fair distance away and the snow was still deep and treacherous. He looked at Thomas, a silent question in his eyes. Thomas stood, the weariness in his bones momentarily forgotten. "I know that mill," he said, the words more to himself than anyone else. Memories flickered behind his gaze, nights spent hauling wood in better years, laughter that echoed off the stone walls, and a name whispered in the dark. "I can go with you," Thomas added, looking at Gabriel, the determination in his eyes unyielding. Gabriel hesitated. Thomas had already given so much, but he saw in the man a purpose reignited, a flame that refused to be extinguished. "I'll come too," Gabriel said, his voice steady as he turned to the crowd. "And we'll need lanterns. This night won't be kind to anyone lost in the dark." Mrs. Ingram stood, surprising herself and those around her. "I have lanterns at my home. I'll bring them," she said, her voice soft but resolute. A young man stepped forward, pulling at his scarf. "And I'll help guide the way," he said, his voice quaking only slightly. One by one, more voices joined in, offering blankets, ropes, and whatever strength they had. Within minutes, a small procession formed, lanterns lighting the path as they moved like a line of fireflies through the white, silent streets. The snow crunched beneath their boots, the wind whispering secrets between the skeletal branches of old oaks. Gabriel, Thomas, and Elias, who refused to stay behind, led the way, the glow of their lanterns casting long, trembling shadows. Each step seemed to echo with the weight of past regrets, hopes renewed, and silent prayers sent skyward. When they reached the mill, the scene was dire. A horse lay on its side, steam rising from its body as it struggled to move, its eyes wide and rolling. Beside it, a man's leg was trapped beneath, his face pale and lined with pain. "It's James," Elias whispered, recognizing the miller's son, known for his quiet kindness and the way he played with the town's children. Gabriel and Thomas exchanged a glance, understanding passing between them in an instant. Gabriel knelt beside James, assessing the situation. The man's leg was pinned tightly, blood seeping through the fabric of his trousers. "We need to lift the horse just enough for him to pull free," Gabriel instructed, turning to the crowd that had gathered, their faces a mix of fear and resolve. Thomas stepped forward, bending low to meet James's eyes. "Hold on, lad," he said, voice strong and steady. "We'll get you out." With ropes brought from Mrs. Ingram's house and the combined strength of a dozen pairs of hands, they worked in a tense silence, broken only by the labored breaths and the snort of the horse. Thomas coordinated the efforts, his voice directing, guiding, as though he had done this 1,000 times. "On my count," he said, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. 3, 2, 1, lift! The horse shifted, muscles straining as the combined force of the townspeople lifted its weight just enough. James gasped as he dragged himself free, his face contorted in pain but alive, his breath visible in the night air like a blessing. The horse, now freed from its burden, scrambled to its feet, shaking snow from its mane and standing trembling but unhurt. A collective sigh swept through the crowd, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the rapid thud of hearts finding their rhythm. Thomas fell to his knees, the night and the effort finally catching up with him. Gabriel moved to steady him, eyes filled with gratitude. "You did it," Gabriel whispered, the words carrying more meaning than mere praise. Thomas nodded, his gaze on James, who now sat with Elias's small hands clutching his arm. The boy's eyes were wide, tears frozen on his cheeks as he looked between the faces that had saved his friend. The people who once passed Thomas without a glance now saw him for who he was, someone whose past had not stripped him of worth, but forged him into a man who could bring light to the darkest corners of their lives. As the crowd began to disperse, murmurs of relief and exhaustion rippling through them, Gabriel stood and looked at Thomas, who sat in the snow, his breathing ragged. The man's eyes, though weary, shone with a kind of peace Gabriel had not seen before. The night had tested them all, and Thomas had proven to be the linchpin that held them together when the cold threatened to break them apart. A sudden cry broke the night's tentative calm. "It's James!" Mrs. Ingram shouted, pointing toward the miller's son, who had begun to shiver violently. The color drained from his face as pain etched new lines into his youthful features. "He's losing blood too fast," Gabriel said, moving quickly to James's side. The wound on his leg, now fully visible, was deep and needed more than bandages and prayer. Panic threatened to crack the resolve of the townspeople who huddled closer, their breaths clouding in the frigid air. Thomas pushed himself to his feet, knees shaking but eyes sharp. "We need to cauterize the wound," he said, scanning the area for anything that might help. Gabriel's eyes widened in realization, and he nodded, knowing what had to be done. "Bring a lantern here," Gabriel called, and a young man rushed forward, hands trembling as he passed it over. Thomas took it, the glass warm against his cold fingers, and unscrewed the top, exposing the flame that danced hungrily. The crowd held its collective breath as Thomas leaned down to James, the young man's eyes wide with fear. "This will hurt," Thomas said, his voice a deep, calming murmur. "But it will save you." James nodded, tears streaking down his cheeks, mingling with the sweat and snow. Gabriel squeezed the boy's shoulder, whispering prayers that tangled with the vapor of their breath. Thomas brought the flame close to the wound, and the night exploded into a brief, sharp scream as the scent of burning fabric and flesh met the icy air. Elias buried his face in his grandfather's arm, his small body trembling. The crowd flinched but stayed rooted, unable to look away. Then, silence fell once more, broken only by James's sobs that soon turned into shuddering breaths as the pain dulled. "It's done," Thomas said, the words heavy with exhaustion but steady. The makeshift cauterization had stopped the bleeding, and though the pain was palpable, it was the only way. Thomas's hands shook as he handed the lantern back, his body quivering as if every ounce of energy had been drained from him. Gabriel stood, his eyes finding Thomas's. "You've given us more than we deserved," he said, voice low but full of emotion. The priest's eyes, always weary with the weight of responsibility, now glistened with gratitude. Thomas smiled faintly, but before he could respond, a sharp gasp rippled through the crowd. A thin, wiry man with a face weathered like old parchment stepped forward, eyes narrowed with recognition. "Thomas Breyer," the man whispered, the name cutting through the crowd like a blade. "I know you." Gabriel glanced between them, the sudden tension twisting in his gut. Thomas's face darkened, a shadow of something painful passing over his eyes. The man stepped closer, pointing a finger that trembled from cold and memories. "You're the doctor who vanished from Hollis when the fire took the hospital," the man continued, voice growing louder. Gasps followed, eyes wide with shock and curiosity. Murmurs of realization rippled through the crowd as the stories resurfaced. Tales of a gifted doctor who disappeared after tragedy struck, a mystery long whispered in the corners of inns and markets. Thomas's face tightened, but he met the man's gaze squarely. "Yes," he said, the words steady, final. The wind seemed to hold its breath as the truth settled over everyone. Gabriel's eyes widened with understanding. A doctor. The realization hit him like a sudden wave, connecting the fragments of stories, the skill with which Thomas had saved James, the practiced way he had worked, as if drawing on old instincts buried deep. The crowd shifted, some stepping back with expressions that ranged from astonishment to judgment. Mrs. Ingram's mouth opened in a small O of shock, while others whispered hurriedly among themselves. The man who had spoken narrowed his eyes, distrust hardening his expression. "Why did you run, Thomas? Why did you leave them?" Thomas's face fell, the weight of the question evident in the droop of his shoulders. He looked past the man, past the crowd, and into the dark recesses of the night, searching for the right words. "I left because I failed," he said finally, his voice heavy and broken. "I couldn't save them. The fire, it took too many too fast. I ran from my own shame, from the faces I couldn't save." His voice cracked, and he clenched his fists, as if holding himself together by sheer will. "I couldn't bear to face the families. I couldn't face myself." A profound silence followed, the kind that hangs thick, suffocating, as people process the revelation. Gabriel stepped forward, breaking the stillness. "You've saved tonight," he said, eyes steady on Thomas. "And perhaps that is what matters now." A young woman's voice, quiet but strong, rose from the back of the crowd. "My mother was one of those who died in that fire," she said, stepping forward. Her eyes were wet, but there was no hatred in them, only grief long carried. "I know who you are, Thomas Breyer, and I see what you've done here tonight." She reached out, placing a trembling hand on his arm. "Thank you," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. The crowd held its breath again, waiting for the fracture, the sharp edges of judgment to cut through. But it didn't come. Instead, a sense of something beginning to mend passed through the people gathered, tentative but real. Thomas nodded, the smallest of nods, as if daring to believe in the possibility of redemption, even after all this time. Gabriel looked at the faces around him, faces that had once been hard with skepticism, now softened, their edges blurred with empathy and shared humanity. The wind picked up once more, but it was gentler now, less biting, carrying with it the promise of a dawn still unseen but surely coming. The night stretched on, each heartbeat a note in a symphony of silence and shared breath. The crowd stood shoulder to shoulder, the chill biting through their clothes but somehow less fierce, as they listened to Thomas's confession and the murmur of absolution that followed. Thomas's eyes glistened with unshed tears, the shame of old ghosts mingling with the fragile hope that now flickered inside him. Gabriel stepped closer, his voice low and unwavering. "Tonight you didn't run. You stood by this town, by us. That is what we will remember." A tremor passed through Thomas's body, not from the cold, but from the rawness of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. Before he could respond, a small figure detached itself from the crowd. Elias, his eyes wide and bright, reached out and took Thomas's hand in his small, warm grip. "You're a hero," the boy said, his voice simple and full of conviction. The words hung in the air, delicate but unbreakable. A murmur swept through the onlookers, the warmth of shared relief and revelation breaking the tension. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as Elias's innocence, so freely given, melted something inside him that had been frozen for years. He knelt, his face now level with the boy's, and managed a shaky smile. "Thank you, Elias," Thomas whispered, the words trembling with gratitude that went beyond expression. Before more could be said, the old man James, still pale but steadier now, stirred from where he sat propped against the mill wall. "Father Gabriel," he rasped, reaching out a weak hand. Gabriel moved to his side, leaning down to listen. James's eyes found Thomas's, and he nodded slightly. "Thank you, both of you. You saved me." Gabriel stood and turned to the crowd, his heart swelling with emotions he couldn't name, but knew he would carry forever. "This is the meaning of tonight," he said, his voice filling the crisp air. "Forgiveness, courage, and the strength to rise when all seems lost." The words seemed to unlock something in the gathered townspeople. Mrs. Ingram, who had once been quick to judgment, stepped forward and touched Thomas's arm lightly. "We all carry burdens," she said, her voice soft and hesitant. "Maybe it's time we carry them together." Others nodded, and the rigid lines of suspicion that had marked their faces began to dissolve. An elderly man who had been standing near the back stepped forward. "Thomas," he said, clearing his throat, "I lost a brother in that fire. I blamed you because it was easier than facing the truth of loss. But tonight, I see that none of us is without fault or fear. I'm sorry." Thomas's chest rose and fell as he absorbed the man's words. The years of guilt, the running, the fear of looking into the eyes of those who had once respected him, all of it settled and shifted, not gone, but lighter. He bowed his head, a tear slipping down his cheek, and whispered, "Thank you." Gabriel watched, his heart lifting as he saw the ripples of change moving through the crowd. This was not just about one man's redemption. It was about a town finding its way back to the warmth of community, to a place where forgiveness was possible and hope was not a luxury, but a necessity. The snow had begun to fall again, softer now, its silence a balm over the weary souls gathered. A child's giggle broke the stillness, cutting through the heaviness with a sound so light it made several people smile. Elias's small hand tugged at Thomas's sleeve. "Can we go back to the chapel now?" Elias asked, his voice breaking through the moment with innocence and trust. Gabriel exchanged a look with Thomas, who nodded, his mouth curving into the faintest smile. "Yes, Elias," Thomas said, standing and straightening his back, no longer the stooped figure who had arrived at the chapel's door hours before. "Let's go home." The procession back to the chapel was different this time. No longer a trail of uncertain feet, it was a unified march. lanterns bobbing like stars lighting their way. The wind whispered around them, not with the cold, biting edge of earlier, but with the gentle touch of renewal. When they reached St. Anne's, the fire inside glowed bright, welcoming. The congregation, now larger than before, filled the chapel, each face marked by the night's events. Gabriel led them in another hymn, this one soft and hopeful. The voices rose, mingling in harmony. A prayer not just for Christmas, but for every day that would follow. Thomas stood at the edge of the crowd, not quite part of it, yet no longer outside it either. The townspeople's voices lifted around him, and slowly he joined in. His voice was cracked, carrying the strain of years, but it was there, brave and unwavering. Gabriel's eyes met his over the heads of the congregation, and he nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had taken together this night. The hymn built and swelled, filling every corner of the chapel and, for a moment, spilling out into the snowy street where the world lay silent and peaceful. Outside, the snowflakes settled on the rooftops and branches, a blanket over a town that had changed in the space of a single night. Inside, the warmth of the chapel resonated not just from the fire, but from the hearts that now beat in time with forgiveness, hope, and the quiet strength of second chances. The first light of dawn crept across the horizon, turning the blanket of snow outside the chapel a delicate shade of pink and gold. Inside, the congregation remained, their voices now a low murmur, as the events of the night began to settle into the stories they would carry forward. Some sat, their heads bowed in silent prayer, while others exchanged glances, tentative smiles breaking through faces lined with exhaustion and newfound hope. Gabriel stood at the altar, his gaze sweeping the room. He took in the sight of Mrs. Ingram offering a cup of warm tea to Thomas, who accepted it with a nod of gratitude. Elias, tucked under the arm of his grandfather James, had finally dozed off, his small body rising and falling with each of the old man's deep, steady breaths. The fire crackled softly, filling the quiet moments with a soothing warmth. Gabriel approached Thomas, who sat with his back straight, the weariness in his eyes now mixed with something lighter. "You brought more than healing tonight," Gabriel said, his voice low and sincere. "You reminded us of who we can be when we see each other clearly." Thomas looked up at him, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. "I think I needed the reminder too," he replied, his voice rough but sure. The room around them seemed to breathe with shared understanding. A soft knock at the chapel door drew everyone's attention. Gabriel turned to see a woman standing in the open doorway, snow dusting her hair and shoulders. Her eyes, dark and familiar, searched the room until they found Thomas. She hesitated, as though testing the threshold before stepping inside. Thomas's eyes widened, a tremor passing through him. He whispered, the name carrying the weight of old regrets and unfinished story. The woman took a few steps forward, each one deliberate, until she stood before him. "I heard what happened tonight," she said, her voice steady but thick with emotion, "and I couldn't stay away. I had to see for myself." Her eyes softened as she looked at him, the lines of pain and strength in her face mirrored in his own. Gabriel took a quiet step back, giving them the space they needed as whispers filled the room. Miriam's hands, gloved and trembling, reached for Thomas's. He took them, his calloused fingers brushing against hers, the touch tentative but real. "It's been so long," he said, eyes glistening with tears that threatened to fall. She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Too long, but tonight I saw the man I once knew, the one who was lost to all of us after the fire." Her voice broke, and she took a deep breath. "I think it's time we come home, Thomas." A murmur of warmth rippled through the crowd as they witnessed the reunion. Those who had come in search of hope found it in the way two hands could meet again after years of absence, in the way forgiveness could bridge even the deepest chasms. Elias stirred, his eyes fluttering open at the sound of voices. He looked around sleepily and saw Miriam standing by Thomas. "Is she part of the miracle too?" he asked, his voice small but curious. Gabriel chuckled softly, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Yes, Elias, she's a part of the miracle we made tonight." Thomas's smile widened, the tension in his body releasing as he stood and pulled Miriam into a gentle embrace. Around them, the congregation's expressions shifted from surprise to joy, their hearts lifted by the scene. For a moment, the small chapel felt like the safest place in the world, a sanctuary not only from the cold outside, but from the loneliness and fear that had once been carried within its walls. Gabriel cleared his throat, drawing the attention of the room. "Tonight, we were given a gift," he said. "A reminder that the spirit of Christmas isn't just in the traditions we hold, but in the acts of love, forgiveness, and courage we offer each other. Let us carry this with us, not just tonight, but always." Heads nodded, and a soft round of applause began, hesitant at first, but growing as it spread through the room. Thomas looked around, his vision blurring with tears, but he did not hide them. He stood taller, holding Miriam's hand with a grip that said everything he could not. Gabriel stepped back toward the altar, where the candles still flickered with a warm, golden glow. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a peace he hadn't known in years, as if a part of himself long forgotten had been found. The fire crackled once more, the sound like laughter in the silence, and Gabriel knew that this Christmas morning would not be remembered just for the cold or the snow, but for the way a lost man had found his way back, bringing with him the kind of miracle that did not fade with the dawn. The town of Mill knew, as they left the chapel and stepped into the light of the rising sun, that they would never pass Thomas Breyer without a nod, a smile, or a word again. And Thomas knew, as he stood between Gabriel and Miriam, that his years of running had ended and a new chapter had begun, a chapter of healing, not just for him, but for everyone gathered there. The morning sun pushed away the last vestiges of night, its soft rays touching the snow-laden rooftops and casting long, golden shadows across the quiet town. The bells of St. Anne's Chapel tolled, not in their usual somber tone, but in a series of peals that rang with joy. The people who filed out of the chapel wore expressions transformed by the night's events. Conversations, filled with awe and warmth, hummed softly as they moved down the cobbled streets, leaving a trail of laughter and whispered stories. Gabriel watched them go, his heart full and light for the first time in years. The weariness that had settled deep into his bones seemed to melt away, leaving behind a buoyant sense of renewal. He turned back to see Thomas standing in the aisle, Miriam beside him, their hands still entwined. A smile crept across Gabriel's face as he approached them. "Thank you," Thomas said, his voice low but steady. It was not just gratitude for the night or the warmth of acceptance, but for the chance to be known again. Gabriel placed a firm hand on Thomas's shoulder. "No," Gabriel replied, eyes twinkling with sincerity. "Thank you for showing us what grace truly looks like." Miriam smiled, her eyes crinkling with a joy that had long been absent. She looked at Gabriel and then at the room still filled with the glow of candles and the soft, steady crackle of the fire. "It feels like this place has been blessed tonight," she said softly. "It has," Gabriel agreed, taking a deep breath. He glanced at Elias, who stood with his grandfather, the child's face bright with the unfiltered joy of youth. Elias met his gaze and grinned, a front tooth missing and eyes wide with unspoken questions. "Father Gabriel, will we have stories like this every Christmas?" he asked, his voice ringing with hope. Gabriel chuckled, the sound full and free. "We can only hope, Elias, but tonight you were a part of one of the greatest stories we could ever tell." Thomas took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs with a sharpness that felt invigorating rather than harsh. He looked at Miriam, the lines of her face softened in the morning light. "I want to stay," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "If this town will have me." Miriam's eyes glistened as she squeezed his hand. "We never stopped waiting for you, Thomas. This is your home, if you're ready to come back." A ripple of relief washed over him, the tightness in his chest finally loosening after years of burden. Gabriel stepped back, allowing the moment to envelop them. The chapel, now nearly empty, held an echo of song, hope, and whispers of prayer that would linger for days to come. The last of the parishioners had left, leaving behind a silence filled with peace. Gabriel turned to the altar and extinguished the candles one by one, their smoke curling upward like tiny, fragrant ghosts that dissolved into the rafters. He left one candle burning, its light a testament to the night's events, a beacon for anyone who might come looking for warmth or forgiveness in the coming days. Thomas walked slowly to the window, Miriam by his side. Outside, children began to play, their laughter ringing out like the bells. Neighbors stopped to chat, hands waving in greeting. The tension of old grievances washed away with the snow. The town, once divided by years of misunderstanding and quiet pain, now felt whole. Gabriel stood in the doorway, watching Thomas and Miriam as they turned toward him. The morning sun framed them, casting golden halos around their heads. It was a sight that brought a lump to his throat, a reminder that redemption often comes not in grand gestures, but in moments of simple, profound grace. "Will you come back tonight for the evening prayer?" Gabriel asked Thomas, the question carrying the weight of an invitation not just to join, but to belong. Thomas nodded, a smile finally breaking free, the years of regret folding into lines that spoke now of hope. "Yes, I will." And with that, Gabriel turned and stepped out into the crisp morning, the light catching on the frost and scattering like 1,000 tiny blessings over the town of Mill. St. Anne's stood tall behind him, no longer just a building of stone and wood, but a sanctuary reborn, marked by the night when the town found its heart again. As he walked, the bells rang once more, their sound carrying across the rooftops and out to the fields, announcing to the world that this Christmas had been a night of miracles, not just for a priest, a lost doctor, and a small boy, but for everyone who dared to believe that forgiveness and hope were always within reach. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to HeroKind Stories for more tales that remind us of the resilience of the human spirit. Share this story with friends and family, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. Your support helps bring these stories to life and keeps the spirit of kindness alive.